The story centers around racial profiling and its harmful effects on both individuals and society. Alan Thompson, a black FBI agent, is wrongly detained by Officer Jack Lawson in Riverside Park simply because of his appearance. Despite being an innocent man enjoying a peaceful moment, Alan is suspected by Lawson due to his unconscious racial bias. The officer approaches Alan with suspicion and questions him aggressively, treating him as a potential criminal despite having no evidence of wrongdoing. Alan, well aware of the bias he faces, remains calm and composed throughout the encounter, using his emotional resilience to avoid escalating the situation. He asserts his rights by asking if he is under arrest, forcing Lawson to confront the unjust nature of his actions. The realization that Alan is an FBI agent shatters Lawson's assumptions, but by then, the damage is already done. Alan has been wrongfully detained. This incident highlights the systemic issue of racial profiling within law enforcement, emphasizing the need for accountability, reform, and introspection. Officer Lawson's mistake becomes a moment of self-reflection, but it also serves as a catalyst for change. The story calls for a broader societal and institutional commitment to dismantling racial biases in policing, creating a more just and equitable system for all individuals, regardless of race. The narrative also stresses the importance of hope and future change, advocating for collective action to address racial injustice. Alan's call for reform is not just about correcting one officer's mistake, but about reimagining a system that treats everyone with fairness and respect. Racial profiling and prejudice. Racial profiling is a deep-seated issue in society, one that perpetuates inequality and division. It goes beyond simple misjudgments or coincidences. It's a reflection of societal biases ingrained over generations. In the story of Officer Jack Lawson and Alan Thompson, this tragic reality is brought to light in a powerful and unsettling way. The scene begins in Riverside Park, a seemingly peaceful space where people gather to enjoy the serenity of nature amidst the hustle and bustle of city life. Alan Thompson, an FBI agent, sits on a weathered bench, engrossed in a book, seeking the quiet solace that the park provides. There's nothing extraordinary about his presence. He is simply a man taking a break, enjoying a moment of peace. Yet, to Officer Lawson, his calmness, his demeanor, and his appearance spark suspicion. Lawson, a seasoned officer who has patrolled the area for years, notices something about a black man, sitting alone, seemingly at ease in a public space. Lawson's intuition, a feeling he trusts from years of experience, begins to gnaw at him. In a fleeting moment, he makes an assumption. This man doesn't belong here, or at least not in this park, not in his view of the world. Lawson's initial reaction is subtle, a flicker of doubt that flares into a certainty grounded not in any real behavior or criminal activity, but in his own unconscious biases. He doesn't see a man enjoying a quiet afternoon. He doesn't see Alan as a person at all, but rather as a stereotype, a potential threat, simply because of the color of his skin. Lawson's decision to act isn't based on facts, on anything Alan has done, or even on any real evidence. It is born from years of internalizing societal narratives that paint black individuals as inherently suspicious, dangerous, or out of place in certain environments. This is the essence of racial profiling, seeing a person not as an individual, but as a representative of a group, a label that carries with it assumptions and prejudices. Lawson doesn't stop to consider Alan's right to be there, his humanity, or the possibility that his initial assessment might be wrong. Instead, his gut instinct tells him that Alan, because he is black, is doing something wrong. It doesn't matter that Alan is simply reading a book, participating in a perfectly innocent activity. Lawson's perception is clouded by the color of Alan's skin, and that perception is enough to escalate the situation. As Lawson approaches Alan and begins questioning him, the officer's body language and tone reflect this underlying assumption. He doesn't ask questions out of curiosity or genuine concern. He questions Alan with the belief that something is amiss, that Alan is hiding something. In Lawson's mind, he is already painting Alan as a criminal, someone who must prove his innocence rather than being granted the presumption of it. The questions come rapid fire. What are you doing here? Can I see your ID? There's an edge to Lawson's voice, a presumption of guilt that doesn't belong in a professional encounter. Alan, however, remains calm. He doesn't bite back, doesn't escalate the tension. Instead, he answers politely, but his mind is already aware of the inevitable. Lawson has already made up his mind. Alan is not unfamiliar with this dynamic. Throughout his life, he has navigated situations where he is judged by his skin color before anything else. He knows the weight of being perceived as other, the exhaustion of constantly being looked at with suspicion, even in his moments of peace. But he does not falter. He remains steady and composed, understanding that his calmness may be the only thing that stands between him and a situation spiraling further out of control. When Lawson demands to see his ID, Alan's response is measured. Am I under arrest? He doesn't challenge the officer aggressively. He simply asserts his rights, forcing Lawson to confront the reality that his actions are not grounded in the law, but in bias. What happens next is predictable. Lawson escalates. In the absence of any real justification, he resorts to power, to force, to control. He cuffs Alan and leads him toward the patrol car, an act that further solidifies the reality of racial profiling. The officer doesn't listen to Alan's attempts to explain. He doesn't care about Alan's identity or the simple truth that he is just another citizen enjoying a peaceful moment. Instead, Lawson's decisions are based on an assumption rooted in the color of Alan's skin. As the patrol car drives Alan toward the precinct, the absurdity of the situation becomes even clearer. Alan isn't worried for himself. He knows the truth will come out. But his frustration, his weariness, is palpable. He knows all too well the toll that these moments take. Not just physically, but emotionally. They are reminders of a system that continually devalues people like him, seeing them through the lens of racial prejudice rather than as individuals with their own stories and worth. It is a reminder of how people, even those with the power to enforce the law, are conditioned to treat black individuals as threats rather than as equals. For Officer Lawson, the moment of realization comes too late. When he learns that Alan is an FBI agent, he is forced to confront the mistake of seeing Alan through the narrow lens of his own biases. But this recognition doesn't erase the damage already done. It doesn't undo the moment of unjust detention, nor does it erase the frustration and emotional toll Alan had to endure. The incident becomes a reflection of a much larger problem, one that cannot be solved by simply admitting an error or apologizing. It is a symptom of a culture that perpetuates racial bias in law enforcement, a culture that needs to change from the inside out. Racial profiling isn't just a matter of individual mistakes. It's a systemic issue, one that affects not only the people directly involved, but also the broader community. It fosters mistrust, deepens divisions, and perpetuates inequality. The story of Officer Lawson and Alan Thompson highlights just how dangerous these biases can be. It shows how easily a person's dignity can be stripped away based on assumptions that have nothing to do with the person in front of you. And it shows that these biases, when left unchecked, can lead to disastrous consequences, not just for the individuals affected, but for the integrity of institutions meant to protect and serve everyone. This story calls for reflection, for change, and for a commitment to seeing people not as representatives of their race, but as individuals with their own lives, experiences, and rights. It's a call to confront the uncomfortable truth about how racial biases shape our society, and to work towards a world where people are judged by their actions, not their skin color. Calm and composed response. In a world where black individuals are often unjustly scrutinized and presumed guilty, Maintaining composure in the face of prejudice becomes both a form of survival and a subtle act of resistance. Alan Thompson, an FBI agent, finds himself in exactly this situation, sitting in Riverside Park, simply enjoying a quiet moment in the midst of a busy day. When Officer Jack Lawson approaches him, it's not just a routine interaction, it's the beginning of yet another encounter where Alan's very existence is questioned. His calmness, his ability to stay composed, becomes the one thing that stands between him and escalating conflict. In this moment, Alan's response is not just a matter of personal control, it is a reminder of the constant emotional labor that people of color must endure when faced with suspicion simply because of their race. Alan knows this drill all too well. Throughout his life, he has experienced countless moments when his presence, simply because of the color of his skin, has been interpreted as something dangerous, something to be feared. But despite these constant challenges, Alan has learned how to respond to keep his emotions in check, how to remain calm even when every instinct in his body wants to react. He has no illusions about the world he lives in, a world where his identity is often reduced to a stereotype, where his innocence is not the default assumption, but something he must prove. When Officer Lawson approaches, Alan doesn't flinch. He doesn't instantly bristle with anger, though he has every reason to. He doesn't raise his voice, though he knows that doing so could very well be seen as a threat. Instead, he meets Lawson's eyes with a quiet, steady gaze. He remains composed, his body language calm, sending a message to the officer that he is not afraid. This response, however, is not just a display of personal control, it is a conscious choice. Alan understands the consequences of a misstep. He knows that in the face of aggression and prejudice, reacting with anything but calmness can be dangerous. His ability to remain composed is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. It is a reminder of the emotional resilience that Black people must cultivate simply to navigate spaces where they are not seen as fully human. Alan's response is also a profound act of self-preservation. It is a calculated decision to avoid exacerbating the situation. He understands that in a world where his mere presence is often viewed with suspicion, any outward display of frustration or fear could be misinterpreted as an invitation for further aggression. His calmness is a shield, a way to disarm the officer's preconceived notions without directly confronting them. He doesn't challenge Lawson in a way that could escalate the interaction, but neither does he passively accept the officer's assumptions. He holds his ground, quietly asserting his right to be treated with dignity and respect. When Lawson demands identification, Alan does not immediately comply. He knows the law, knows he is under no obligation to show ID simply for sitting in a public park. But Alan is also acutely aware of the fine line he must walk. Refusing to show ID could be seen as defiance, and that defiance could quickly spiral into something far worse. Instead of reacting with frustration or anger, Alan chooses to ask a simple, direct question: "Am I under arrest?" His tone is measured, calm, and even. He doesn't raise his voice or make any aggressive moves. In those few words, Alan asserts his rights, reminding Lawson that his actions are unjustified. Yet, he does so in a way that doesn't provoke further confrontation. His calmness is his power, his way of maintaining control over the situation when the officer is clearly losing his own. The decision to remain composed in this moment is not born from a desire to please the officer, nor is it out of fear of the consequences. It's a deliberate choice rooted in survival. Alan knows that he is not the one in the wrong, but he also knows that the world doesn't always care about his innocence. He has seen far too many instances where Black individuals who do not comply with the expectations of authority face brutal consequences. In this moment, Alan's restraint is an acknowledgement of the unspoken rules of the world he inhabits, a world where anger or fear, even when justified, can be fatal. Alan's ability to stay composed is also a reflection of the strength required to navigate a system that often dehumanizes him. His calmness doesn't just serve to protect himself physically, it also protects his dignity. In the face of an unjust arrest, he refuses to be reduced to the stereotype Lawson expects. He does not flinch, he does not argue unnecessarily, and he does not succumb to the temptation to fight back in ways that could give the officer more ammunition to justify his actions. Instead, Alan's calmness challenges the officer's assumptions. It becomes clear that Alan is not the person Lawson believes him to be, not because he has to prove his worth, but because the officer's suspicion was unfounded from the start. What is also significant about Alan's composure is the quiet message it sends to others who may be watching. In a society that often pits people of color against authority figures, Alan's calmness is a reminder of the strength and grace required to simply exist in spaces where you are seen as a threat. His refusal to react impulsively becomes a way to defy the narrative that people of color are inherently unruly or dangerous. His composed response is a lesson in how to hold on to one's humanity even when others refuse to see it. This moment is more than just a personal choice. For Alan, it is a reflection of the emotional labor that many black individuals must perform daily to navigate spaces where they are marginalized. Alan's calmness is not just a response to one officer, but a response to a lifetime of similar encounters. It is a manifestation of the countless times he has been forced to keep his emotions in check, to mask his frustration, anger, and hurt, simply to survive. In the end, Alan's composed response serves as a reminder of the power in restraint. It is an act of quiet defiance in a world that demands more from people of color than it does from others. It is a refusal to let prejudice dictate his response, to let assumptions and biases define his worth. It is a moment that transcends the individual interaction and speaks to a broader truth that in the face of injustice, the calm, composed response is not just about keeping peace, but about asserting one's right to exist without fear. It is a powerful testament to the strength required to navigate a world that often sees you as less than, yet refuses to define you. The moment of revelation in the story is a powerful turning point that forces both Officer Lawson and the audience to confront the depth of their assumptions and biases. As the events unfold, the arrest of Alan Thompson, a man wrongly accused, is rooted in a misunderstanding that stems not from the actions of the individual in question, but from the prejudices deeply embedded in society. When Lawson finally realizes that Alan is not a random suspect but an FBI agent, the weight of his mistake comes crashing down on him, but the damage already done cannot be undone. The truth is no longer just about Alan's identity, it's about the profound consequences of the assumptions that led to this moment. Alan, calm and composed throughout the encounter, had been aware from the start that Lawson's suspicion was unfounded. He knew the moment he was questioned by the officer that the arrest was based on nothing more than a stereotype, a prejudice, and a racial bias. Alan understood the dynamics at play. He had been in this situation countless times before, where his mere presence in a space was questioned because of the color of his skin. But what made this moment different, and what truly hit Alan with the force of truth, was that his identity, his role as an FBI agent, was something that Lawson could not ignore. Alan wasn't just a black man in the park. He was someone who held power and responsibility, and yet that didn't shield him from suspicion. His position, his profession, his accomplishments, none of it mattered when Officer Lawson's preconceived notions clouded his judgment. For Lawson, the realization is jarring, a moment of self-discovery that comes too late. It is the moment when he realizes that he has arrested someone who is not only innocent, but who is far from the image he had constructed of a criminal. In that instant, Lawson is forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that his actions, which were driven by his biases and assumptions, were not just misguided, they were dangerous. The power of that realization weighs heavily on him as the full extent of his mistake becomes apparent. He had arrested an FBI agent, a highly respected one at that, for no reason other than his own personal suspicions. And what is most devastating for Lawson is that the very thing he had thought to be his instinct, his trained ability to assess danger, had been entirely based on an irrational and harmful assumption about Alan's race. It's easy for people, especially those in positions of authority, to believe that their judgments are infallible, that their years of experience make them immune to error. Lawson had walked the streets of the city for decades, and in his mind, he knew it better than anyone. He had learned to rely on his instincts, to trust the little nudges of suspicion that came with years of training and experience. But what he failed to understand, what he failed to recognize until it was too late, was that those instincts were shaped by the very biases that society ingrains in all of us. Lawson's error wasn't just one of misjudgment, it was a reflection of a system that had taught him to see black men as threats first and individuals second. He had assumed that because Alan was black, because he was in a park, because he was sitting quietly, he must be doing something wrong. The reality was that Alan, in his peaceful solitude, posed no danger to anyone. It was Lawson's perception that was flawed, clouded by prejudice and an inability to see past his own racial biases. Alan's identity as an FBI agent, a man with authority and credibility, was not just a piece of information, it was the revelation that shattered the narrative Lawson had constructed in his mind. It forced Lawson to confront the fact that he had arrested someone who, by all accounts, was a respected professional. The moment of realization was not just about Alan's job or his role in society. It was about the painful truth that Lawson had made a mistake that was driven by his unconscious biases rather than any real evidence or suspicion. Lawson's realization doesn't immediately erase the harm done. The arrest has already been made, and Alan has already been wrongfully detained. The consequences of Lawson's actions, both personal and institutional, are only just beginning to unfold. For Alan, the moment of revelation is less about the shock of being recognized and more about the quiet affirmation of the truth he had known all along. Alan had been calm, measured, and composed not because he knew his identity would eventually be revealed, but because he understood the deeper dynamics at play. His identity, as an FBI agent, should never have been the reason for his treatment. Yet in the world Lawson inhabited, it was only when Alan's position became known that the officer's actions began to shift. The officer's mistake wasn't simply about failing to recognize Alan's job, it was about seeing Alan through the lens of racial profiling in the first place. The truth of who Alan was, revealed too late, serves as a stark reminder of how often the worth of an individual is determined not by who they are or what they've accomplished, but by the assumptions others make based on their appearance. This revelation highlights the toxic effect of racial profiling, not just on the individuals targeted, but on the systems that perpetuate it. Lawson's discovery of Alan's true identity doesn't erase the wrong done. It doesn't undo the emotional toll that Alan has already endured, nor does it restore the dignity that was stripped away when he was wrongfully arrested. It's a painful moment of truth that reveals how deeply ingrained bias can shape our interactions with others. Alan's composed response and eventual reveal force us to confront the reality that our perceptions of others are often more reflective of our own biases than of any objective truth. The story, at its core, is about the harm done when we fail to see each other as individuals. It's about the damage caused by assumptions and stereotypes. The revelation that Alan was an FBI agent is not just a twist in the narrative, it's a powerful metaphor for the often invisible layers of prejudice that shape our worldview. It's a reminder that no one should ever have to prove their worth or identity to gain respect and fairness. And yet, in a world still struggling with racial bias, that is exactly what many people, particularly people of color, are forced to do every day. The truth, as revealed in this moment, is that the system isn't just flawed, it is built on assumptions that need to be dismantled, one painful realization at a time. The consequences for Officer Lawson are not just a reflection of a single mistake, but rather the beginning of a painful and necessary reckoning with the deeply ingrained biases that shaped his actions. It's easy for anyone to justify their actions when they're certain that they are in the right, when they believe they are operating within the bounds of the law and upholding the ideals of fairness and justice. But what happens when those actions, driven by assumptions and prejudices, are exposed for what they truly are: harmful, unjust, and deeply damaging to the very system they're supposed to protect? For Officer Lawson, the initial realization of his mistake learning that Alan Thompson was an FBI agent shatters his perception of himself and his actions. At that moment, he understands that the arrest he made was not just a minor error. It was a direct violation of the principles he swore to uphold when he became a police officer. Lawson, who had prided himself on his ability to read people and assess situations, is now forced to face the truth. His actions were not based on evidence, reason, or even suspicion of wrongdoing. They were based on something far more insidious: his racial biases, which led him to see Alan as a criminal before he ever took the time to understand the man in front of him. The weight of this understanding is overwhelming. His career, his reputation, and his very sense of self are now in jeopardy. It's a crushing realization for Lawson, one that is difficult to shake off. The consequences that follow are not just professional, they are personal. Lawson finds himself standing on the edge of everything he has worked for, looking into the abyss of what might be lost if the investigation into his actions moves forward. He is placed on temporary leave, a signal that his actions have warranted serious scrutiny. For an officer who has spent over 2 decades on the force, the possibility of losing his badge is a nightmare he cannot escape. This isn't just about an arrest gone wrong. It's about the failure to adhere to the standards of justice he was supposed to embody. The temporary leave is a quiet but powerful marker of how far his actions have deviated from what is expected of someone in his position. It's a moment of reckoning where Lawson is forced to confront the consequences of allowing his biases to dictate his actions, and the toll it takes not only on his own life, but on the lives of others. As the investigation into his conduct unfolds, the pressure mounts. The department begins to assess whether Lawson's actions were the result of a singular lapse in judgment or whether they reflect a deeper, more systemic problem within the force. The stakes are high, and Lawson cannot avoid the truth for long. The evidence is clear: Alan Thompson was wrongfully detained, not because of anything he did, but because of the assumptions Lawson made about him. The body cam footage, the witness testimonies, and even the way Lawson had approached Alan, all of it points to one undeniable fact: the officer allowed his biases to guide his actions. This isn't just a failure of judgment, it's a failure of integrity. Lawson's ability to discern truth from suspicion has been corrupted by the prejudices that lurk beneath the surface of his decisions. For Lawson, the consequences go beyond the loss of his job. They extend into the erosion of his self-image. A man who had spent his entire career believing he was upholding justice now has to face the fact that he has become part of the problem. His internal conflict is profound. How does someone reconcile the man they thought they were with the person they have proven to be? How does one come to terms with the reality that, in a moment of unchecked bias, they contributed to the very injustice they had vowed to fight? Lawson's personal struggle is a painful one. He must now reckon with the fact that his actions were driven not by his duty to protect and serve, but by his ingrained prejudices. This revelation is not just difficult, it's deeply humbling. And it is here, in this moment of vulnerability, that Lawson must confront the fact that real change can only come when he accepts responsibility for his actions. The most profound consequence for Lawson, however, is the realization that his actions reflect a broader issue within law enforcement system that too often allows prejudice to inform decisions, especially when it comes to the treatment of people of color. Lawson's arrest of Alan is not an isolated incident. It is part of a much larger pattern of racial profiling, biased policing, and the dangerous assumption that certain individuals, based solely on their appearance, are guilty until proven innocent. This systemic issue, which Lawson is now forced to face, is what truly haunts him. He understands on a deep level that his actions are not just an affront to Alan, but to the very ideals of justice and fairness that the police force is meant to represent. As the internal investigation moves forward, Lawson faces disciplinary action. He could be fired, stripped of his badge, and cast out of the very institution he has dedicated his life to. The thought of termination is terrifying to him, but even more so is the knowledge that his actions may have irreparably damaged the trust between the police and the community they are meant to serve. The damage done is not just to one individual, it's to the very fabric of the relationship between law enforcement and the public, particularly communities of color. Lawson's mistakes have far-reaching implications, and the road to redemption, if it even exists, will be long and fraught with difficulty. But despite the immense weight of the consequences, there is a glimmer of hope for Lawson's future. This moment of reckoning, though painful, is also an opportunity for growth and change. Lawson now has the chance to reflect deeply on his actions, to understand the impact of his biases, and to begin the process of self-awareness that can ultimately lead to redemption. It's not an easy journey, but it's a necessary one. Lawson's story is a reminder that while the consequences of our actions are often severe, they are also opportunities to learn, to grow, and to strive for a better understanding of the world around us. And in that understanding, there lies the potential for true change both for him and for the system that allowed him to make such a mistake in the first place. The need for change. The need for change is not just an abstract concept or a distant goal, it is a pressing, urgent necessity. It is a truth that resonates deeply in the wake of moments like the one between Officer Lawson and Alan Thompson. When biases, whether conscious or unconscious, shape the decisions of those entrusted with the power to enforce the law, the very foundations of justice are shaken. What transpired during that arrest is not a mere isolated failure. It is part of a larger systemic issue that has been ingrained in law enforcement for far too long. It is an issue that demands to be confronted, not in a piecemeal or reactive way, but with a full, unwavering commitment to transformation at every level of policing. In the story, Alan Thompson's experience is not unique. It is, in fact, a reflection of the daily reality for many people of color, particularly black individuals, who are often viewed through the lens of suspicion and distrust, regardless of their behavior, their intentions, or their innocence. The racial profiling that took place during Alan's encounter with Officer Lawson is not an outlier. It is a manifestation of a larger societal issue that affects every aspect of policing. In this context, the need for change becomes undeniable. It is a demand for a system that truly upholds the principles of equality, fairness, and justice, a system where officers are held accountable for their actions, and where those actions are guided by a respect for all individuals, not just those who fit a particular mold. At the heart of this need for change is the recognition that law enforcement agencies cannot simply rely on the status quo to correct the issues within their ranks. The system, as it currently stands, too often protects those who perpetuate injustice, allowing them to continue their harmful practices with little consequence. The pattern of racial profiling, the assumption of guilt based on race, and the bias that drives police encounters cannot be eradicated with superficial fixes or isolated incidents of accountability. True change requires a deep, structural overhaul that challenges the very foundations of how policing is approached and understood. Captain Sarah Bennett's role in the aftermath of Alan's wrongful arrest underscores the importance of leadership in this process of change. She recognizes the magnitude of the problem, and she understands that addressing it requires more than just disciplinary action against one officer. It requires a collective commitment from the entire department, from the highest-ranking officials to the newest recruits, to actively confront their own biases and work toward a system that treats every citizen with dignity and respect. Bennett's willingness to address the issue head-on, to revise training protocols, and to create space for honest conversations about racial bias within the force is a crucial step in the right direction. But even with her dedication, she knows that real change cannot happen overnight. It will take time, persistence, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths that have been buried for far too long. This need for change is not just about fixing what went wrong in a single situation. It is about ensuring that such situations never happen again. It is about eradicating the mindset that leads to the assumption that a black person in a public space, simply existing, is inherently suspicious. It is about recognizing that a person's worth should never be determined by the color of their skin or the preconceived ideas that others have about their background. Alan's calmness in the face of racial profiling, his ability to stay composed despite the unfairness of the situation, is a powerful reminder of the emotional labor that people of color are forced to perform in order to navigate a world that doesn't always see them as fully human. And yet, it is also a call to action, a call for those in positions of power to recognize that this dynamic cannot continue, that the need for change is not optional but imperative. Law enforcement agencies must acknowledge that their work is not just about enforcing the law, it is about building trust with the communities they serve. Trust is the bedrock of any healthy relationship between police officers and the public. But that trust is eroded when biases shape decisions. It is further broken when officers who act on those biases face little more than a slap on the wrist. Real change means fostering a culture of accountability, one where officers are trained to recognize their own biases and are equipped with the tools to challenge those biases in real time. It means creating systems of oversight that are transparent and effective, systems that do not allow bad actors to slip through the cracks. The need for change also extends beyond the police force itself. It is a call to society as a whole to confront the deeply entrenched biases that exist within all of us. Racial bias is not something that only exists in the minds of law enforcement officers. It is something that permeates every part of our culture, from the media to education to politics to the workplace. Law enforcement is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. For real progress to be made, society must take responsibility for its role in perpetuating these prejudices. It requires an honest examination of how black people and other people of color are treated and portrayed in our culture. It requires a commitment to dismantling the structures that uphold racial inequality, both within the police force and beyond it. As much as Captain Bennett and others within the department may strive for change, it will ultimately take more than just one department to transform a society so deeply rooted in racial bias. It requires the collaboration of every individual, every institution, and every community to work toward a world where fairness is not a privilege, but a fundamental right for everyone. This is the true meaning of the need for change. Not just to fix one instance of injustice, but to ensure that no one else ever has to endure what Alan Thompson went through, or worse. The urgency of this change is underscored by the reality that the consequences of inaction are too severe to ignore. The failure to address the systemic issues within law enforcement and society at large allows the cycle of prejudice and mistrust to continue. It means that people like Alan Thompson, who are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, will continue to face unjust treatment. It means that those who are tasked with protecting and serving the public will continue to act out of prejudice rather than truth. And it means that the ideals of justice, equality, and fairness that this country claims to uphold will remain out of reach for too many. The need for change is not just a demand for better policing. It is a demand for a better, more just society. It is a demand for a future where people of color no longer have to prove their worth or their innocence, where they can live their lives without the constant threat of discrimination and bias. It is a call for all of us to recognize that the work of justice is never truly done, and that the fight for a fairer world requires all of us to step up, to question the systems that have been in place for far too long, and to demand something better for ourselves and for the generations that will come after us. This need for change is not just about fixing what went wrong in a single situation, it is about ensuring that such situations never happen again. It is about eradicating the mindset that leads to the assumption that a black person in a public space, simply existing, is inherently suspicious. It is about recognizing that a person's worth should never be determined by the color of their skin or the preconceived ideas that others have about their background. Alan's calmness in the face of racial profiling, his ability to stay composed despite the unfairness of the situation, is a powerful reminder of the emotional labor that people of color are forced to perform in order to navigate a world that doesn't always see them as fully human. And yet, it is also a call to action, a call for those in positions of power to recognize that this dynamic cannot continue, that the need for change is not optional, but imperative. Law enforcement agencies must acknowledge that their work is not just about enforcing the law, it is about building trust with the communities they serve. Trust is the bedrock of any healthy relationship between police officers and the public, but that trust is eroded when biases shape decisions. It is further broken when officers who act on those biases face little more than a slap on the wrist. Real change means fostering a culture of accountability, one where officers are trained to recognize their own biases and are equipped with the tools to challenge those biases in real time. It means creating systems of oversight that are transparent and effective, systems that do not allow bad actors to slip through the cracks. The need for change also extends beyond the police force itself. It is a call to society as a whole to confront the deeply entrenched biases that exist within all of us. Racial bias is not something that only exists in the minds of law enforcement officers. It is something that permeates every part of our culture, from the media to education to politics to the workplace. Law enforcement is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. For real progress to be made, society must take responsibility for its role in perpetuating these prejudices. It requires an honest examination of how Black people, and other people of color, are treated and portrayed in our culture. It requires a commitment to dismantling the structures that uphold racial inequality, both within the police force and beyond it. As much as Captain Bennett and others within the department may strive for change, it will ultimately take more than just one department to transform a society so deeply rooted in racial bias. It requires the collaboration of every individual, every institution, and every community to work toward a world where fairness is not a privilege but a fundamental right for everyone. This is the true meaning of the need for change, not just to fix one instance of injustice, but to ensure that no one else ever has to endure what Alan Thompson went through, or worse. The urgency of this change is underscored by the reality that the consequences of inaction are too severe to ignore. The failure to address the systemic issues within law enforcement and society at large allows the cycle of prejudice and mistrust to continue. It means that people like Alan Thompson, who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, will continue to face unjust treatment. It means that those who are tasked with protecting and serving the public will continue to act out of prejudice rather than truth. And it means that the ideals of justice, equality, and fairness that this country claims to uphold will remain out of reach for too many. The need for change is not just a demand for better policing, it is a demand for a better, more just society. It is a demand for a future where people of color no longer have to prove their worth or their innocence, where they can live their lives without the constant threat of discrimination and bias. It is a call for all of us to recognize that the work of justice is never truly done, and that the fight for a fairer world requires all of us to step up, to question the systems that have been in place for far too long, and to demand something better for ourselves and for the generations that will come after us. Alan's call for systemic reform. Alan Thompson's call for systemic reform transcends the singular encounter he had with Officer Lawson in Riverside Park. It is not just a plea for justice in his specific case, but a powerful demand for a fundamental shift in how law enforcement operates, how society views people of color, and how deeply embedded biases are acknowledged and dismantled. What Allen experiences during that wrongful arrest is a microcosm of a much larger issue that affects millions of individuals who are unfairly targeted, profiled, and treated as criminals based solely on their race. His call for reform is not just about fixing one officer's mistake, but about reimagining a system that has repeatedly failed people of color and continues to perpetuate racial inequalities at every level. From the moment Allen is detained, he remains composed, refusing to let the officer's assumptions dictate his response. His ability to maintain control over his emotions in the face of injustice is not just a personal triumph. It is a demonstration of the internal strength that people of color must develop to navigate a society that often sees them as threats first and individuals second. But Allen's calmness is not born out of acceptance. It is born out of necessity. Necessity to survive and to navigate a system that has long been stacked against him. In every moment of restraint, he understands that his identity, his very humanity, is being questioned. And yet, despite this, he does not react out of anger or frustration. Instead, he focuses on something larger, the need for change in a system that allows these injustices to continue without consequence. What Allen demands, both in his actions and his words, is not merely an apology from Officer Lawson or a simple acknowledgement of the mistake made in the park. He calls for a complete overhaul of the way law enforcement interacts with the communities they serve. His experience as an FBI agent, a professional who has worked within the system, gives him an undeniable perspective on the gaps and flaws that exist in policing. He understands the power and authority that comes with the badge, but he also understands that authority, when misused, can be a tool of oppression. His calm demeanor and his refusal to allow himself to be intimidated by Lawson is a reflection of his understanding that he has an obligation to demand more from the system, an obligation to fight for something better, not just for himself, but for everyone who has been harmed by it. Allen's call for systemic reform is rooted in the recognition that one officer's mistake is a symptom of a much larger problem. It is a problem that exists within the very structure of law enforcement, where racial bias and profiling are often allowed to go unchecked. This problem is not confined to one individual, nor is it something that can be solved through isolated incidents of accountability. Allen knows that true reform requires more than just removing one officer from the force. It requires a change in the culture of policing itself, an overhaul that ensures that all officers are trained to recognize and challenge their own biases, an overhaul that puts an end to the assumption that certain individuals, particularly people of color, are guilty simply because of how they look. One of the most powerful elements of Allen's call for reform is his insistence on accountability. He recognizes that the actions of Officer Lawson were not simply a matter of individual error, but a reflection of the deeper systemic issues that plague law enforcement. For Allen, reform cannot just be about punishing those who make mistakes. It must be about creating a system where mistakes like this don't happen in the first place. It must be about creating a culture of accountability, where officers are not only held responsible for their actions, but are also educated on how to actively confront their own biases. The change that Allen calls for is not just about addressing a single incident. It is about transforming the way law enforcement functions, from how officers are trained to how they engage with the public. Moreover, Allen's perspective emphasizes the need for deeper reflection within law enforcement on the broader societal issues that influence policing. He understands that while police officers are on the front lines, they are also part of a larger social structure that has perpetuated racial inequality for centuries. This system does not only affect Black individuals, but it shapes the way all people are treated based on their race, ethnicity, or appearance. Allen's call for reform is not limited to law enforcement. It is a call for society as a whole to confront and dismantle the structures that uphold systemic racism. He knows that true reform is not just about changing policies, it is about changing the way we, as a society, view and treat people of color. It is about undoing generations of prejudice, bias, and inequality that have been embedded into every facet of life, from the criminal justice system to education, healthcare, and beyond. The emotional weight of Allen's call for reform lies in his recognition that his story is not unique. His experience in the park, while deeply personal and unjust, is just one of many. He knows that there are countless others who have faced similar situations where their worth, their innocence, and their humanity were questioned based solely on their appearance. Allen understands the deep exhaustion that comes with constantly having to prove one's innocence and one's right to exist in a world that often sees people of color as suspects rather than citizens. His call for reform is a call to end that exhaustion, to create a world where everyone, regardless of their race or background, can walk through life without fear of being profiled, harassed, or unjustly treated. Ultimately, Allen's call for systemic reform is not just about addressing the wrongs that were done to him or to others like him. It is about creating a world where justice is not a privilege, but a right for everyone. It is about creating a system where individuals are judged by their actions, not their race, and where law enforcement is not a tool of oppression, but a true protector of the public. Allen's journey, his steadfast refusal to be intimidated, and his unwavering call for change serve as a powerful reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing. It is a call for those in positions of power, those in communities affected by injustice, and society as a whole to do the hard work of confronting bias, questioning assumptions, and working together to create a more just and equitable world for all. Accountability and moving forward. Accountability and moving forward are intertwined concepts, especially when we reflect on the aftermath of a wrongful arrest and the deeper implications of systemic bias in law enforcement. The moment when Officer Lawson realizes the gravity of his mistaken unjust arrest of Alan Thompson, an FBI agent marks the beginning of a journey that demands not only personal reflection, but also institutional reckoning. The process of accountability is far more than simply admitting fault. It is a call for change, both at an individual and a societal level, and a crucial step toward a future where justice truly means fairness for all. Accountability begins with the acknowledgement of wrongdoing. For Officer Lawson, this is a humbling and painful realization. It is one thing to make a mistake. It is another to recognize that those mistakes are a reflection of the prejudices and biases that shape his actions, often without his full awareness. The arrest of Allen was not a simple error of judgment. It was a product of a system that has long allowed racial assumptions to guide decision-making. The moment Lawson acknowledges this truth, it becomes clear that this is not just a personal failing, but a reflection of a deeper, more systemic issue. It is a recognition that the process of accountability cannot be superficial or restricted to one individual. It must extend to the entire system that allowed this injustice to unfold. For Allen, the need for accountability is not just about seeking reparation for the wrong done to him, it is about ensuring that this mistake, this violation of his rights, does not go unaddressed or unexamined. Allen's calmness throughout the encounter with Officer Lawson is not an act of passivity. It is an act of vigilance. He understands that in a society where people of color are often wrongly accused, their voices are the ones that need to be heard and validated. His call for accountability is a call to examine not just what happened in that specific instance, but the larger patterns that have allowed racial profiling and bias to persist unchecked within law enforcement. Moving forward from an incident like this requires more than just acknowledging the mistake. It requires a commitment to doing better, to actively changing the systems that perpetuate injustice. The decision to hold Officer Lawson accountable, whether through disciplinary action, retraining, or even termination, is important, but it is only the beginning. True accountability means ensuring that this moment serves as a catalyst for deeper change within the police force and society at large. It means using this painful moment as an opportunity to confront the biases that live within the system and to create structures that prevent such failures from recurring in the future. For Officer Lawson, the process of moving forward is not just about facing the consequences of his actions. It is about confronting the uncomfortable truths that his actions exposed. It is a process that demands introspection and humility. Lawson must ask himself hard questions. How did his biases go unchecked for so long? What systems or attitudes allowed him to make such an unjust assumption about Alan? And, perhaps most importantly, what will he do to ensure that his future actions are guided by fairness and respect for all individuals, regardless of their race? Moving forward requires a willingness to engage in this self-examination and a commitment to doing the necessary work of addressing and confronting personal biases. On a broader scale, the need for accountability also extends to the police department and the community at large. Law enforcement agencies must recognize that the responsibility for change does not rest solely on the shoulders of individual officers. While individual accountability is important, it is the collective responsibility of the entire system to ensure that bias and prejudice do not shape the way officers interact with the public. This means that police departments must invest in comprehensive training on racial bias, de-escalation techniques, and community engagement. It means holding officers accountable not only for their actions, but also for their attitudes, beliefs, and understanding of the communities they serve. Moving forward also requires a shift in the culture of policing itself. The relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve has been strained for years, particularly in communities of color. In order to rebuild trust, the entire system must change. This means fostering a culture of transparency, where officers are not only held accountable for their actions, but also feel empowered to hold each other accountable. It means ensuring that the values of fairness, respect, and empathy are prioritized in every aspect of police work, from recruitment to daily interactions with the public. For Alan, the process of moving forward is not just about personal closure, but about the hope that these systemic changes will create a safer, more just world for everyone. The emotional weight of moving forward is significant for both Alan and Officer Lawson. Alan, having been wronged, must navigate the difficult terrain of forgiveness and healing. His pursuit of accountability is not rooted in anger or the desire for revenge. Rather, it is rooted in a deep desire for justice, for a world where people like him do not have to face prejudice and suspicion simply because of the color of their skin. For Lawson, moving forward means accepting that his actions, while driven by internalized biases, were still harmful. It means understanding that the consequences of those actions extend far beyond the individual level and have a lasting impact on the communities he is sworn to protect. The journey of moving forward is not easy, but it is essential. It is about acknowledging the past, both the mistakes and the injustices, and using that acknowledgement as a foundation for change. It is about learning from those mistakes, understanding the profound impact they have on others, and committing to doing better in the future. The emotional depth of this process is not lost on Alan, who understands that true accountability is not just about punishment, but about growth, understanding, and change. It is not enough for Officer Lawson to simply face the consequences of his actions. He must actively engage in the work of becoming a better officer, a better person, and a better ally to the communities he serves. For Alan, moving forward is a journey of hope that his experience will lead to a greater understanding of the flaws in the system and ultimately to a more just and equitable society. Accountability and moving forward are not just about individual acts of justice. They are about systemic change. They are about transforming a world where bias and prejudice continue to thrive into one where fairness and respect are the guiding principles of law enforcement and society as a whole. This process will be long, but it is one that must be undertaken if we are ever to achieve a truly just world. It is a journey that begins with accountability, but moves forward with a collective commitment to building a better future for everyone. Hope for future change. Hope for future change is both a promise and a challenge, one that requires the collective will to confront uncomfortable truths and the courage to envision a better, more equitable world. The story of Alan Thompson and Officer Lawson is not merely an isolated incident of racial profiling and injustice. It is a reflection of a larger, deeply ingrained issue that affects countless individuals and communities. Yet, in the face of such deep-rooted adversity, there is the potential for transformation if we are willing to look beyond the mistakes of the past and actively work toward a future where justice is more than a word, but a reality for all. The hope for future change is rooted in the belief that, despite the setbacks and injustices that persist, there is always room for growth, learning, and progress. For Alan, this hope is not born from naivety or wishful thinking, but from the quiet but powerful knowledge that every injustice presents an opportunity to create something better. His experience of being wrongly detained, of having his identity questioned based solely on the color of his skin, is a painful one. But in the midst of that pain, there is a resolve and unwavering determination to ensure that the system that allowed such an injustice to happen is not left unchanged. Alan's hope is a hope for a world where no one else has to face the kind of treatment he endured, a world where the actions of one officer are not representative of the systemic biases that plague law enforcement. As much as Alan's experience highlights the flaws and failings of the current system, it also demonstrates the immense power of holding on to hope and demanding change. In the moments following his wrongful arrest, Alan could have been consumed by anger or frustration, but instead, he chose to channel that emotion into something more constructive, a call for reform. It is a recognition that the road to a better future is long and fraught with challenges, but it is also a road that can be walked one step at a time if people are willing to do the work. Hope for change is not just about believing that things will get better on their own. It is about the relentless pursuit of justice, even when the path forward seems unclear. The hope for future change also involves recognizing that reform is not an overnight process, but a journey that requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to confront difficult truths. The culture of policing, with its embedded biases and systemic inequalities, cannot be transformed in a single moment or through a single act of accountability. It will take time, but the seeds of change have already been planted. Captain Sarah Bennett's commitment to addressing the deeper issues within the department and fostering a culture of fairness, respect, and accountability is a crucial first step in that journey. Bennett's leadership serves as a reminder that meaningful change is possible, but it requires leaders who are willing to stand up for what is right, even when it is difficult or unpopular. The hope for future change is also deeply tied to the idea of healing. For Alan, the emotional toll of racial profiling and the trauma of being wrongfully arrested are not easily erased. But through the process of holding the system accountable, through the calls for reform and justice, there is a sense of catharsis, a way to move forward, not just for himself, but for the community as a whole. Alan's experience becomes a catalyst for something larger than himself. It becomes a rallying cry for those who've been harmed by the same systemic issues, a reminder that their voices matter, that their struggles are seen, and that their right to justice is undeniable. At the same time, hope for future change is also a challenge to those in positions of power within law enforcement to look at themselves and ask, what kind of world do I want to help create? Officer Lawson, having confronted his own biases and mistakes, now has the chance to reflect on the kind of officer he wants to be. His actions, fueled by prejudice, hurt more than just a land, they hurt the very fabric of trust between the police and the communities they serve. Lawson's story is a reminder that everyone, especially those in positions of power, has a role to play in fostering the kind of world we want to live in. It is easy to become complacent or defensive when confronted with uncomfortable truths, but true progress can only be made when individuals recognize the impact of their actions and commit to doing better. The hope for future change also lies in the collective efforts of society as a whole. It is not enough for law enforcement to reform alone. Society must also be willing to engage in the work of dismantling racism, challenging stereotypes, and changing the narratives that contribute to racial inequality. The fight for justice is not one that can be won by a single institution or group. It requires the active participation of everyone. The hope for future change is in the recognition that, while we cannot change the past, we have the power to shape the future. Every act of standing up against injustice, every conversation about bias and racism, every step taken toward greater understanding is part of that larger effort. What Alan and Officer Lawson's story demonstrates is that hope for future change is not passive. It is active and requires the willingness to engage with uncomfortable truths. It is a hope that acknowledges the pain and trauma of the past, but does not allow that pain to dictate the future. It is a hope that refuses to accept the status quo, and instead challenges us all to work toward a world that is more just, more compassionate, and more equitable. It is a hope that understands that the road to change will be difficult, but is also one that is worth traveling. The real power of hope lies not just in believing that things can change, but in actively working toward that change, even when the journey seems long. For Alan, the hope for future change is rooted in the belief that the system can evolve, that it can become a force for true justice, and that the voices of those who have been marginalized will be heard. It is a hope that, though born from pain, has the power to inspire transformation, to lead us toward a future where fairness is not a privilege, but a right for everyone. And that is the kind of hope that can drive real, lasting change. Alan Thompson's story is a powerful reminder of the systemic biases that persist in society and how these biases can manifest in law enforcement. His calm and composed response in the face of racial profiling, despite the immense frustration and injustice he faced, became an act of resilience and a call for reform. When Officer Lawson, driven by prejudice, wrongfully detained him, the consequences were far-reaching not only for Lawson, who was forced to confront his own flaws and the systemic issues within the department, but also for Alan, whose experience serves as a catalyst for change. Through this incident, Alan showed that holding on to hope for a better future is crucial, but so is actively working toward that change. The pain of injustice, while deep, can become a transformative force when it leads to a broader conversation about racial equality, fairness, and the importance of self-reflection within systems of power. The lesson from Alan's story is clear. Systemic injustice is not an isolated issue, and confronting it requires personal accountability, introspection, and, most importantly, a collective commitment to change. We all have a role to play in creating a more just society, whether it's by acknowledging our own biases, standing up against discrimination, or pushing for policies that promote fairness and equality. Applying this to our own lives means recognizing when we might unconsciously contribute to the problem, challenging the status quo, and using our voices and actions to help create the world we wish to live in, where justice and dignity are guaranteed for everyone, regardless of race.